Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive in to today's topic, just a reminder, if you have not yet liked or subscribed or left a review or a rating for the podcast, please take a second to just go do that right now. Or if you've done all of those things, but there is an episode that you particularly loved, I would really appreciate it if you would share it with a friend or a colleague or anyone who you think might find it helpful. It really helps the podcast to get discovered by more people in the dance world. All right, today we are going to be talking about lessons that I think the dance world can learn from the most recent Winter Olympic Games. If you've been around here even just for a hot second, you know that I am a big sports fan and I am particularly a massive Olympic fan. I have loved the Olympics for as long as I can remember, really. And generally watch quite a lot of the Olympics every single time it is on. And I did a similar episode to this after the Paris Summer Olympics in 2024. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, feel free, go back, give that one a listen as well. And so I thought I would do the same thing for the most recent Winter Olympics. I actually wasn't planning on doing this podcast episode necessarily. And I did touch on the Olympics a couple of episodes ago when we were talking about how decisions are made when a dancer or an athlete is performing or deciding whether or not to perform if they happen to have an injury. And so I used the Olympics a lot. That was kind of some of the inspiration behind that episode. So I wasn't planning on doing this one, but by the time the games ended, it was so clear that there were so many good lessons that came out of the games. And I think there are every single time big events like that happen. So hence we are having this episode. One of the reasons I think I love the Olympics so much as a sporting event, even more so than other sporting events, although I do watch a lot of other sports as well, but the Olympics are amateur sports at its best. And yes, there are professionals involved now. So for instance, hockey, this year, for the first time in a few years, there was the return of the NHL players to the Olympics. But a lot of sports operate at more of an amateur level. And for a lot of sports, the Olympics is like the pinnacle of their sport. And we see all of these lesser known sports that all of a sudden have a moment to shine on the big stage, on an international stage. People are often discovering sports. The number of people who had never kind of heard of or seen biathlon before was so entertaining to me because I had a friend who was watching it and just thought they were watching cross-country skiing. And all of a sudden they're like, the athletes are down on the snow shooting things. And I was like, oh yeah, it's biathlon. Anyway, it is a chance for a lot of people to discover sports that maybe don't get as much attention or media coverage. And I just see so many parallels between that level of sport and the dance world, or just dance or art in general. We have these incredible athletes, or dancers in our case, who have been working their butts off for years, their whole lives even, and they're training day in and day out and performing day in and day out. And for the most part, the world is sort of largely unaware of them. They're often not making very much money. If any money, they might even be paying to do it. So similar to dancers who are often really struggling to make ends meet or feel like they're getting somewhere in this dance career. So I think that is partly why I love the Olympics. I love the stories of some of these like kind of quote unquote underdogs who the world's never heard of before, even though they've been excelling and competing at the highest level for years in their their careers sometimes, but because their sport does not get as much media attention or sponsorship, or there isn't a professional circuit for it or those types of things, they kind of fly under the radar. And I just always see so many parallels between the dance world. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm drawn to the Olympics more so than other, big sporting events like something like the Super Bowl or something that gets so much, investment and sponsorship and attention and that type of thing. All right. We're going to dive in. I have 5, I don't know if I want to say lessons, but sort of 5 things that I think the dance world should be paying more attention to that I think came out of this year's Winter Olympics. There were many, many, many more. I just had to kind of make it a manageable podcast episode size. So I've picked 5 things that I think I just really want to highlight that I think the dance world can learn from the sport world, but especially the Olympic sport world, because again, it's not every single sport is getting a lot of exposure and investment and those types of things. So number 1, high performance is a team effort. And at the Olympics, at least certainly in Canada, our Olympic coverage was on CBC Gem this year, and they did a really great job of highlighting a lot of the team behind the team. And so there was media coverage about the doctors who are the head doctors of both our men's and women's hockey teams. They happen to be a married couple, which I think was, a great story that was easy to be featured. But in these high performance environments, it is a team effort. There may be one athlete, or in the case of dance, one dancer who is out on the stage, but the team involves so many more people than that. So it could be the physiotherapist, it could be the strength and conditioning coaches, it's nutritionists, it's their actual coaches, technical coaches, there's psychologists involved, in a lot of sports, there's technicians, like in skiing, the ski technicians have so much impact on a skier's ability to go out and race. So if they don't have the right setup on their skis or they haven't been adjusted properly, that could be the difference between a skier getting a medal and not getting a medal and have nothing to do with the skier's actual athletic performance. So similarly in the dance world, we have like our theater technicians, and so we have our stage managers and our lighting and sound designers and all of those types of things. So we have technicians, there could be biomechanists or all of these different people that are all part of this team performance. And this was really highlighted to me watching the opening ceremonies. I was watching it with my family, and my son, who is 10, was really interested in the number of athletes that each country had walking into the opening ceremonies. But he very quickly realized the number of people walking in doesn't match the number of athletes. So it might say the country had, I don't know, like 18 athletes, let's say, depending on what country it is. But there were very clearly, say, 40 people walking in. And that is because the teams are part of that. And so you might have had coaches walking in the opening ceremonies or other parts of the team. So there were often many more people coming in under a country's banner than the number of athletes representing that country. I think in the dance world, and I'm talking mostly in the studio world from this perspective, but it does hold true a little bit even for like the professional company dance world as well, but especially in the studio world, we still rely very, very heavily on a single teacher to quote unquote do it all. So we have the teacher who should be teaching and is teaching the technique, but they're also teaching the artistry and they're teaching the performance. But then they're also managing costumes and they're managing schedules and they're managing travel and they're, also trying to play parent. And there's just so many roles that teachers are expected to do. And I think as a result of that, we are seeing a lot of burnout in dance teachers. I see it online in some of the online forums I'm on that a lot of dance teachers are feeling really overwhelmed and kind of burnt out. But it's because we're not meant to be doing it alone. There should be a team behind our dancers or behind the dancer. And some of the bigger companies are starting to do this really well, where we're seeing the companies that have larger budgets and maybe a higher number of dancers have team members that might be a strength and conditioning coach or a doctor, like a sports medicine doctor or a nutritionist or those types of people as part of the team. But largely as a whole for the dance world, we have not gotten there yet. The vast majority of
the vast majority of settings, we still have kind of a singular person or the singular dancer kind of having to operate alone and not necessarily embracing that team culture or that team environment. The other thing that I think it's worth noting here as well is that although the high performance is a team effort, the athlete, or in this case, the dancer, needs to sort of be the center of it, but they also need to have some autonomy over their role. And so it's almost more like a partnership than, the team telling them what to do, because as we're going to see in a second with my next lesson from the Olympics, having sort of more of a dictatorship model over an athlete or a dancer and trying to control them does not actually work. And so it's not so much that we want our dancer to be this like passive recipient of this team effort. It needs to include everyone, and the dancer really needs to be in the center of that and sort of be a partner in that team or a really critical team member, and not have the team sort of dictating what is happening around them. So lesson number 1, high performance is a team effort. And I think the dance world could do a better job of embracing a team mindset or a team culture and not necessarily relying so heavily on dance teachers having to go it alone and do everything themselves. All right, lesson number 2, joy is a competitive superpower. And there were numerous examples of this throughout the games, but the one that I'm sure most of you guys are going to be familiar with is in women's figure skating, Alyssa Liu, who came and won gold and did it with so much joy and had such a good time doing it. And so for those of you who are not aware of her story, and I feel like at this point the whole world is probably aware of her story, but she was a bit of a child phenom. Her talent was recognized really, really young, and she had a lot of expectations placed on her at a young age. And she ended up quitting. And it's interesting because in the media, they kept referring to it as how she had retired from skating. She was 16. I don't know if at 16 you can call that retiring from skating. Regardless of what we're going to call it, she ended up quitting skating and stepping away from it because she was miserable. She was in an environment where she did not have any control over her training schedule or her training loads, or even from interviews she's done, it sounds like she didn't even have control over what she was eating or what she was allowed to wear. So she was in this quite controlling environment. I'm not going to go as far as to say it was a toxic environment because I don't think that's up to me to say, but from an outsider's perspective, it certainly seemed to be a very controlling environment. And she has come out and said that she was sort of isolated from quote unquote normal life, or like a normal kid's life. So she quit skating because that was kind of probably the only control she felt like she had at the time, was like, they're not letting me control any other aspect of my life. So if I'm not involved in the skating world, they can't control me anymore. So she ended up quitting and sort of exploring other parts of her personality, of her humanness. She, went traveling, she went to school, all of these different things, and somehow found her way back to skating. And I believe, and I don't know if I have the facts totally right on this one, but it sounds like she actually just ended up going to like a public skate at some point and putting skates on for the first time in a few years. And there was no pressure. It wasn't a training environment. She just went out. And as soon as she was on the ice, she remembered that feeling of joy and excitement and freedom and all of the things that she actually loved about skating. And so that was kind of how she found her way back to figure skating. And she came back with just one goal in mind, and that was to have as much fun as possible on the ice. And obviously that led her to success. So I think she's only been back competing for less than 2 years for sure, but maybe even just a year. Like, she's only just come back and right away won the gold medal, something that she had not managed to do previously when she was in this really controlled and, from her perspective, very unhappy environment. And so again, I just think so many parallels that the dance world can learn from this, and especially when we're working with younger dancers or dancers who have a lot of talent and a lot of potential. And sometimes we can see those dancers get pushed really early on, and we need to be really mindful of making sure that those dancers don't lose the joy of dancing and the why of why they are dancing, and making sure that their happiness and their enjoyment and their joy is still central to their experience. And I also think in the dance world, and this is maybe improving and it really depends on what environment you're in, but in some training environments, we actually shy away from that part of enjoyment in terms of allowing the dancers to express their true authentic self or to really express their joy. We have this like dance environment that is based a lot in like tradition, and everything has to kind of be very disciplined and regimented and, you know, a bit controlled. And I think a lot of times people within that more traditional side, and I'm thinking more of the ballet world when I'm thinking of this, but the more traditional side of that, people kind of resist against some of that change and some of that, you know, saying, well, if we take away that discipline and that rigor, we're going to lose the excellence in ballet. And we clearly just saw an example of the exact opposite of that. And you cannot win gold at an Olympic Games without still having excellence. That is not a thing. Like the skater is still training at the highest level. She has discipline. She has that internal motivation and drive. She's just able to do it in a way that still brings her joy. So we haven't lost that piece of it. And so again, in the dance world, I just think we need to be careful about how we are thinking about in training, especially some of these younger dancers and the ones that show a lot of talent and promise at young ages, to make sure that we are setting them up in environments that allow them to continue to explore that. Because if we allow dancers to have autonomy and be able to express their authentic selves, they're going to, in turn, have more internal drive and internal motivation and potentially more resilience, and they're going to have more joy and ultimately more success. So I thought that was such a great lesson. And I know most of you are probably familiar with that story, because I do think it was one of the kind of the biggest stories that came out of the Olympics, was this what was billed as like a comeback story. But I think really at the center of that is just how joy can be such a competitive superpower. All right, number 3. I'm going to call this, I'm just trying to think of a way of phrasing it a bit succinctly, but essentially culture drives performance. And there, again, were numerous examples of this, but I am going to use one example of the U.S. men's hockey team. And I realized that a lot of things happened after they won gold in terms of what was happening in the media and some maybe inappropriate responses to comments and things like that. And I don't want to get into any of that because that is not central to my point at all. I actually want to talk more about what happened before the Olympics. And also, I'm just going to throw in there that as a Canadian, it pains me to be talking about them in their excellence and in winning gold. But I think this is a really powerful lesson, again, that the dance world can learn. So for those of you who maybe don't follow hockey, and certainly not international hockey, the U.S. men's hockey team had not won gold at the Olympics in 46 years, I believe it was. And they had made it to the gold medal game in 2010 for sure, because they played in Vancouver. I want to say in 2002 as well. There had been times where they had been close, but they had always fallen short. So this team was a team that, you know, was under pressure to kind of right that or to come home with the gold medal because they felt like it had been a long time and there was a lot of pressure for them. Their head coach, the current head coach, Mike Sullivan, previously coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins, has a coaching style and a coaching philosophy that really, really hones in on the environment that he is creating for the players. So not so much the tactics or the systems that they're playing under or things like that, but it really comes down to the culture that he drives to create. And that starts in the locker room and then follows onto the ice. And so his sort of philosophy, or what he calls it, is building this safe zone for learning. And so it is an environment that is built on learning and bettering themselves and not having blame when they do things like video analysis. There's no blame in pointing out, oh, you should have done this, or you should have done that, or you missed this pass, or you missed this shot, like whatever. It's all about a safe zone for learning. What do we learn from our previous game? What do we learn from this? How do we move forward? How do we make ourselves better? And he has this quote, and I think it actually came from one of his previous coaches, and who knows, it might be from somebody else more famous than that. I'm not really sure, but the quote that he sort of lives by is, before a player wants to know what you know, they want to know that you care. I'll say that again. Before, and I'm going to change this with dancer, before a dancer wants to know what you know, they want to know that you care. So it's creating this environment of psychological safety, and especially psychological safety in a high pressure environment, or when you are under pressure. So for dancers, if we are in an audition situation or we are in a competition situation, these higher pressure situations, we want to know that there is psychological safety. Those dancers want to know that they're not going to, get yelled at or get blamed if something happens or something goes wrong or they don't win top score or whatever that is. And so that culture and that shift and that leadership is coming from within the team and from within that locker room. And they are all buying into that shared identity. And I think one of the key differences here, or not differences, but everybody wants to be on the same page. And when we think about dance teams or sports teams, we need everybody to be on the same page and doing the same thing in order to get an output that we want. But there is a difference between having everyone buy in and truly believe in that versus just expecting people to comply with something. So we can set rules and we can set standards and we can say, you must comply with this, you must follow this, these are the rules, these are the standards. But unless people truly believe in them as well, and we have that buy-in, you are not going to see success with that necessarily. And again, that's somewhere where I think the dance world sometimes falls short and could maybe do a better job, is we often have a lot of, rules and regulations, for lack of a better description of that, are things we want dancers to follow, and rules, and some of them are unwritten, and again, a lot of them are steeped in tradition. But if the dancer doesn't understand why or the reasoning behind it, we are not going to get that buy-in from them. So yes, maybe they will follow the rules, but are we truly going to see success because of that? Probably not. And there's actually a lot of research that shows this as well. So I'm using Mike Sullivan as the example in the U.S. hockey team, but there's a lot of performance psychology that has done research on this. So this is not just from this example. And so research does show that fear-based environments do not produce results, and especially under high pressure situations. So they potentially produce anxiety or risk aversion, or, performers that quote unquote choke under pressure, or all of those types of things. We want to have those environments that are built around safety and not built around fear. So, like I said, safety, but also care. We want to have that safe zone for learning. Oftentimes that looks like shared decision-making as well. So a little bit less of an authoritarian kind of structure and more shared decision-making, more open communication. And again, obviously in a dance world, and if you're working with young dancers, the teacher is still ultimately the responsible adult in the room, but there are ways that we can involve the dancers in shared decision-making and make them have some more autonomy over themselves to have more buy-in and create a better team culture and more cohesiveness within the team in order to get the performance outputs that we are looking for. So, like I said, open communication, the dancer supporting other dancers' success, and then pressure that is reframed as an opportunity. This is something you hear athletes talk about all the time. You'll hear them say things like pressure is a privilege, or variations on that. And just that idea that if you're in these high pressure situations, there is a reason that you got there. So maybe it is the championship or nationals for dance or whatever it is, the final round of an audition, whatever. There is opportunity and privilege in being in that high pressure situation. And so we can reframe how we perceive that and how our nervous system even perceives that. Instead of it being a threatening environment, can we reframe that and make it an opportunity? And when we do those things, and when we have this culture of safety and an environment of caring, we see much, much higher success rates, and we see the performance output. So in this case, it was the US men's hockey team winning a gold medal, even though they actually underperformed Canada in that game. And I'm not just being salty about this because I'm Canadian. Like, if you look at the statistics in terms of shots and all of the statistics, Canada outplayed the US in that game, but the US had this culture within their team that allowed them to still be successful in those moments. So that is lesson number 3, culture drives performance. Number 4, we saw a lot of examples of psychological skills being trained like physical skills, or trained as much as physical skills. And again, lots and lots of examples of this, but one of the ones that was one of my favorite examples, and just because she's one of my favorite athletes, is Michaela Schifrin. She is she's a ski racer. She actually specializes in slalom. And if you're not familiar with her story, she has in the past had success at the Olympics, but at the previous Winter Games in Beijing, she did not have success. She actually DNF'd, I think, all of her races. She just kept missing gates, and she had some psychological barriers that really had an impact on her performance. And she's been really open about that and talked a lot about all of the psychological training that she has been doing to prepare for coming back on the world stage. And in the meantime, she has been winning every race on the World Cup circuit. She has the most World Cup wins out of any athlete, male or female, in ski racing. Like, she is a phenomenal athlete, but she just kept having this kind of like block when it came to the Olympics. And so she has really embraced kind of intentional self-talk, like really structured, intentional self-talk to help her build her confidence and overcome this pressure and be able to then still perform at her best. And so when she was packing up her room at the Olympics, she showed on social media all these sticky notes that she had on her mirror in the bathroom for the duration of the games. And they were little daily affirmation type sticky notes, things that said things like, be nice, think first, have fun, one step at a time. I can't remember what any of the other ones were, but all of these little sticky notes. And that, kind of blew up on social media because people were like, whoa, the GOAT of ski racing is using these little affirmations. And she ended up winning a gold medal at the Olympics. And so again, obviously, had success with that. But she's not the only example of these psychological skills being trained. There was a lot, again, just of coverage, just behind the scenes coverage, where you could see athletes doing their visualization or their mental rehearsal, mental performance training as they were preparing for their runs. And ski racers do this a ton, and you can see them at the top of the hill, and they're literally, it's the same way dancers mark choreography, like in their head, and you kind of, or like mark it with your hands or whatever, you can see these racers kind of like going down the course, like visualizing every turn, and they'll be like moving their body in turn. And you see it again with some of the sliding sports. So the skeleton or luge or bobsled, there's a lot of mental rehearsal that goes on. And so this is something, again, I think there could just be more utilization of within the dance world. I have talked about this on the podcast before in terms of mental rehearsal or mental imagery used as a performance tool. I'll link that episode in the show notes for this, actually, if you haven't listened to that one, because it is something that I think some dancers utilize a ton, but we could be doing it more. And it's also a really great tool that we can use for dancers if we need to be physically unloading a dancer for some reason. So in most cases, in the case of injury, if we're physically unloading them, but also just if we want to deload or taper before going into a busy competition or show week or things like that, we could actually be utilizing some of these psychological skills much more than we actually are. So I just thought there was great examples within the Olympics of a lot of these athletes really training and using their psychological skills training. And then finally, lesson number 5 that I think the dance world can take from the most recent Winter Olympic Games is leadership is not always loud. And I think a lot of times, and this is not unique to sport or to dance, but in all aspects of leadership, I think there is this idea that oftentimes the leaders need to be, the loudest one in the front of the room and, the most outspoken and commanding attention and all of those types of things. And I just thought there was some great examples throughout the Olympics of showing that leadership can happen in many different ways, and it does not always have to be loud, and a lot of times it isn't loud. And so it's not always about being the star. Sometimes some of our best leaders actually have to kind of remove themselves from that role. And so again, I'm Canadian, so I'm going to use Hockey Canada examples. But for both our men's and our women's hockey teams, our captains of both of those teams were injured during the tournament. So Marie-Philippe Poulin and Sidney Crosby both sustained injuries that sort of removed them from play. And so Sidney Crosby actually chose to have to sit out of the gold medal hockey game. And I think that was just a real highlight of a show of leadership where he could have made the decision to still dress for that game, even if he had less playing time and was on the bench and not playing as many shifts and, still be involved in the game in some way. But he recognized his leadership role to kind of understand that him at, who knows, 50, 60, 70% was not as useful as having another player be able to dress for the game who was going to be at their 100%. And so just that show and demonstration of leadership in a more quiet way, in a removing myself from the center of the situation. And MPP did the same thing. And there was actually, so she went off injured in one of the games and left the bench, went down to the dressing room, whatever. And she actually came back and sat on the bench for the rest of one of the periods because she knew, and she there was interviews with her afterwards, but she knew that the team needed to see that she was okay. She wasn't okay enough to play, but she was okay. So she came and sat on the bench and then went back at the next intermission or whatever, and then didn't come back out. And so again, just recognizing that their leadership went far beyond their ability to play on the ice. And they are both incredibly talented players. And would Team Canada have benefited from having them on the ice in the games that they missed? Yes, absolutely. However, that wasn't possible because of their injury, and they were able to show up and lead in different ways. And I think this was such a good lesson, especially for young dancers who potentially sustain an injury during competition season or right before a show that they're going to miss out on. And oftentimes, there's a lot of, emotion and feeling around them having to miss out on things, but there's such an opportunity for dancers to be able to step into more leadership roles in those situations. And so can they be there to support their other dance mates and offer support in other ways and show up with other skills? I think there is an opportunity that we can use a reframe a little bit around how we view leadership and really embrace some of the more quiet leadership skills. And again, in the dance world, because we like to perform, it's oftentimes the dance world is full of really big personalities who like to be center stage and the center of attention. I think it is easy to overlook some of our more quiet leaders. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention or pay more attention to the people in the background. And whether that's dancers on our team or whether that is teachers within the industry or other people within the dance industry, like competition directors, studio owners, it can be everyone. But I think that embracing some of or recognizing some of the leadership skills of the people who are not the loudest, the stars, the people that are front and center is just such a powerful reminder that leadership can come in all different genres and can be really powerful in different situations. So those are my 5 lessons that I think the dance world could learn from this year's Winter Olympic Games. Like I said, I will probably actually end up doing one of these after every Olympics because I just think there's so many cool stories that come out of the games and seeing people performing at the highest level, at the top of their game on a world stage. So if you did not watch the Olympics, this is your, not reminder, but your nudge to perhaps the next time they are on, which will be the Summer Olympics in 2028, perhaps pay a little bit of attention, because I do think that there are a lot of parallels between these amateur sporting events. And again, some of them are professional, but a lot of these are amateur athletes, these sporting events and the dance world. And I do think the dance world can learn a lot from how these athletes present themselves and how the games are conducted. So that is what I'm going to say on that for today. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. I hope you have a great rest of your day.